Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about the poem As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is a poem that I studied at university and I became very enamored with Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry, and today I'm going to share with you a close reading of the poem, and we're going to get into the stages of reading poetry, which by the way you can apply to reading books as well. This is an objective analysis of the poem. We are not going to be drawing away any form of evaluation on the poem. We're going to be looking at the poem from an objective angle. By analyzing various techniques, writing techniques, we're going to be looking at the content, and we're going to see how the content is complemented by the techniques. If you would like to follow along and do this as an exercise with me, I recommend that you bring a notebook or some kind of document. What you would really want to do is have on one side of the page the poem written out with maybe 2 spaces of lines between each line. I recommend handwriting it out for obvious reasons later. I also recommend that on the other side of the page you leave it blank, and you can pause the video at any time to write down your own observations before I share mine. Let's get into it. The first thing that we should do is read the poem out loud. I'm going to read the poem out loud, but I recommend after I do so, or before I do so, that you try reading it out loud for yourself. As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Okay, pause. Selah. I'd like you to try reading it to yourself if you have not already. Take a pause here. Try it yourself. All right, let's get into the basics. The first thing that we're going to do is try to figure out, what is Gerard Manley Hopkins trying to say here? I'm going to go through this line by line. However, before we begin, I recommend that you write down on your piece of paper what you think this poem is about. Look carefully at each line and try to figure out what's going on for yourself. When you're ready, press play again. First off, I'd like to make a general observation. Even though this poem is split in the middle, it is, to all intents and purposes, a Petrarchan sonnet. The rhymes at the end goes A, B, B, A, C, B, B, C, and then it goes E, F, E, F, E, F, which is a little bit strange. It's a little bit different, but it is still very much a sonnet. And like everything that Gerard Manley Hopkins does with his poetry, he is in some ways negotiating what a sonnet is. And we're going to get into how he did this in other forms. Okay, so let's break down each line. I'm going to look at them in sections for clarity's sake. Lines 1 through 4 looks at various things, animate and inanimate, in the world. And this part of the poem is very focused on imagery and is basically explaining what these things do, what these animals do, what these inanimate objects do. So for example, kingfishers catch fire, probably a reference to the red breast of the kingfisher. Stones are ringing. Dragonflies are catching fire, probably because of the silver bodies of the dragonflies in the sunlight will have the appearance of twinkling. And of course, bells have tongues, both literally and metaphorically, as they make sound. This whole section is very sensory. It links us to the sight and sounds of human experience within the wider world, within the natural world, as well as within the world of humans and man. Now let's go to the next section, line 5 through 7. Line 5 through 7 sums up how these things are part of how everything in existence basically has its own being. So while being separate, while doing distinct things that they are created to do, they are still very similar in the sense that all of these objects, both animate and inanimate, animal and non-animal, are in fact selving. Now there's a very difficult line, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. And I had to sit there and think for a bit. My personal interpretation of this particular line is that the indoors is a reference to their innermost selfhood that encompasses what they are dwelling. In a way, they are dealing out or showing themselves from within to the without. So whatever is within them that is the telos of their being is now being dealt out into the world as part of the process of selving. It's a very difficult line, and perhaps I will be thinking about this line to the end of my days. Line 6 through 8 basically is defining selving. Selving is to go itself, to speak itself, to act itself, right? The poem defines selving within its stanza. But I will elaborate on selving, okay? Just because it's such an interesting expression. Basically, for Gerard Manley Hopkins, selving is a mode of self-expression. It's an idea that he developed and talked about a lot. It's probably linked to more mystical Catholicism that sees the world as a physical expression of God in its entirety. Now, some people see selving as a form of individuation. That would be a more secular analyst's take. Others see selving as an exploration of spirituality, and that would be a more, religious person's take. And this is where the interpretation of selving can be a little bit complicated, because an analyst will either just want to talk about it from a spiritual sense or talk about it from a theological sense. And I think those are absolutely valuable readings in their own right. However, I don't think either reading is helpful for literary analysts. Today, we're dealing with the language and how the language is married to the concepts. So, while secular minds tend to strip deeper meanings, and thus the beauty of GMH's work, on the other hand, spiritual people tend to just use his poem as a way to talk about their own theology. And I feel like that kind of shortchanges how we can look at the poem in and of itself. What I will say about selving is that for Gerard Manley Hopkins, as we can see in this poem, selving is a form of telos. It is the reason for being as much as the actual expression of being. So we can see this in the line, "What I do is for me, for that I came." So it's not about actually being selfish. It's not about being narcissistic. It's actually about simply carrying out what you were created to do. Now, of course, Gerard Manley Hopkins knew that the world isn't so beautiful and perfect, and much of his poetry touches on this overwhelming sense of desolation and sadness because nature has been corrupted and has been transformed negatively. It has been crushed by humankind, and humans themselves have become tarnished. And this is a constant exploration within his poetry, but in this particular poem, we see a more optimistic or hopeful view that selving, whether or not the existence of the world has become tarnished, selving still happens on a fundamental level. Now, later on in lines 9 and 10, we see Hopkins turn the poem, right? So I've been talking about all of the selving and we're relating it to nature. We're relating it to inanimate objects. And so you might be thinking, oh, wow, that sounds a bit pantheistic. It sounds a little bit, but actually it's not really. It's more considering perhaps that God is immanent through all of nature. And in many ways, we can see it in our own writing. When we write, we can never fully divorce ourselves from our writing. Our creation will always hold our own imprints, our own beliefs, our own skills and abilities and identities. In this way, God himself is imprinted on the world. And that is one of the reasons why, for example, in the Bible, God says that no human will be able to say, well, I didn't know, because God says that he is revealing himself through nature to a certain degree in such a way that humans have no excuse for not seeking him out on a more formal level. So in line 9 and 10, Gerard Manley Hopkins kind of switches gears, and he carries this concept of selving from the natural world to the human state. And we get to the line, I say more, the just man justices keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces. Okay, so what's that about? Well, it's actually a reference to Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8 says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And so this is basically talking about the minimum requirement that God is asking from humanity. Just being just and upholding goodness and truth, right? Also being loving and showing mercy, being gracious, and humility, walking humbly before God. Okay, and so in this line, he's clearly drawing on Micah 6:8, clearly. Then, having called humans to a higher form of living, Gerard Manley Hopkins then gives us the main takeaway of this whole thing. In lines 10 through 14, he notes that humans acting justly and gracefully are selving what they were intended to be, which is Christ. So behaving this way, they selve Christ and they become Christ in God's eyes. God doesn't see them anymore as being corrupt and transformed by sin. He sees them as Christ. And this really touches on the theology that Gerard Manley Hopkins held to, which is that the act of salvation with a combination of good works repairs our relationship with God, and that God will see us as his son. He won't see imperfection. He will see his son who died for us. It's a reminder that within everyone, sanctified or not, there is potential to achieve selving in the eyes of God. And because of that potential, there is innate value in humanity, as much as there is innate value in nature as well. Okay, so that is the content. Pretty heavy content. We'll get more into the analysis later, but for now, we're going to leave the content. We kind of hopefully have an idea. If you need to, you can always stop, replay this section again, and take notes as you wish. We are now going to go into part 2, the poetic techniques. I'm going to be touching on 3 major poetic techniques. The first technique is called sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm is a very special way of rhythm that Gerard Manley Hopkins more or less developed beyond what it had been before. So basically, sprung rhythm is the number of stressed syllables in the line is set, but you can put as many unstressed syllables as you want in. So to quote Britannica, in sprung rhythm, a foot may be composed of 1 to 4 syllables. Usually in normal poems, it's about 2 to 3 syllables per foot that is used. Because stressed syllables often occur sequentially in this patterning rather than in alternation with unstressed syllables, the rhythm is said to be sprung. So basically, there's a bit of a give and take. instead of going da 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 da. In Hopkins' work, you can kind of go da 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 da, right? But as long as you have the 4 stressed, then you're good. You're good-ass. Once again, it's kind of up to you to kind of decide for yourself how many stressed you're going to get per line versus the unstressed. It's up to you. But it's a very, very strange way of writing poetry compared to what everyone else was doing at his time. Now, I just want to clarify, and Britannica notes this as well, Hopkins did not claim to invent this. He simply theorized on it a bit more. He developed a bit more. In some ways, you could say he popularized it. So, for example, there's a nursery rhyme, ding dong bell, pussy's in the well. Right? Ding dong bell, those are 3 stressed. Pussy's in the well. So you have pussy in well. But then you have this odd pussy and the. So it's a bit odd. It's a bit off. If you say it over and over to yourself, you can hear that. And this kind of insertion of the unstressed at points is part of what makes sprung rhythm. And ding dong bell, pussy's in the well is actually a very old nursery rhyme. And apparently Piers Plowman, which is something I read a long time ago, so I'd have to go back and reread it, also uses a form of sprung rhythm. And so Hopkins was simply refamiliarizing himself with this very esoteric way of approaching rhythm. And of course, because rhythm is really depending on how people read the words, how it sounds, how the poem can sound will sometimes vary from reader to reader. And as a result, Hopkins' poetry, just like how he approached the sonnet, Hopkins' poetry is challenging regular meter and he's challenging free verse. He's in this beautiful niche in between having regular meter and having no meter at all. And so in some ways you could say he is negotiating standardized practices of rhythm. And I think that's really, really cool. And yeah, it's just very, very fascinating. Of course, like all poets, he is also relying on imagery. So he's talking about kingfishers with fire, dragonflies and flames. He's talking about roundy wells. He's talking about tucked strings, right? He's talking about hung bells, and so on and so forth. And he has these beautiful images of the human body, right? Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, right? So there are some very, very powerful, very powerful, appealing words that kind of bring out images, hopefully, in our heads as we're reading it. Of course, he is also using some other standardized figurative language. For example, he uses the word like each tucked string tells. So that is actually a simile. Technically, the simile also equals to the bell. The bell is actually also part of a larger simile. And the bell has a tongue, and that is in some ways because the clapper of the bell is sometimes considered to be the tongue. It is a personification and a metaphor in many ways. And so that's a common form of figurative speech, is metaphors and personification. And on top of that, there is repetition. He repeats words quite often, and this repetition is going to be very helpful in something that we're going to talk about a little later. And finally, what is very interesting as well is that he is creating the strong imagery of Christ in people. And I think when it says Christ plays in 10,000 places, I think that it's also a very interesting image. Just let it sit with you. I think it's very, very deep and meaningful the more you think about it. Now, one thing that the constant repetition does is that it feeds into something that Gerard Manley Hopkins is famous for. He really loves his alliteration, consonants, and assonants. Now you might be going, I don't remember what these are. Don't worry, we'll review it. Okay, so let's get into it. So first off, alliteration involves repetition of any sound at the beginning of a word. So for example, in the poem The Eagle by Tennyson, one of the lines goes, he clasps the crag with crooked hands. And the k sound at the beginning of clasps and crag and crooked, that's a k sound repeated at the beginning. That's alliteration. Okay. Then there's consonants. Consonants involves repetition of consonant sounds anywhere in the word. Could be at the beginning, could be in the middle, could be at the end. So in his poem Mother to Son by Langston Hughes, there is, well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up. So in this one, we have the L sound, we have a T sound, and this is all part of consonants. Finally, we also have assonants. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds anywhere in a word. So we have the famous poem Bells by Edgar Allan Poe. Hear the mellow wedding bells, golden bells. What a world of happiness their harmony foretells. So there's a lot of short E vowel sounds. So it's mellow wedding bells, golden bells, happiness, and foretells. So there's a lot of sounds in there. So these three sound imagery or sound figurative language, it's a form of manipulating sound for various reasons. And a lot of people don't think about it, but in English, we have a lot of hard sounds, t, k, d. And we also have a lot of soft or warm sounds like f, n. And depending on what sound you use, you can actually evoke different emotions. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit down, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through the entire poem, and we're going to try to pick out as many examples of consonants, assonants, and alliteration. So before we continue, I recommend that you sit down yourself. I would get out a couple different pens, different colored pens, make some marks for yourself. See if you can circle any alliteration, consonants, or assonants. Write down what sounds are being repeated on which line. I'm going to proceed to a blackboard and I will show you how to parse the lines. But for now, if you want to, you can try it for yourself. Okay, so let's get into this. We're going to go through slowly and we're going to underline everything that might be rhyming. We're going to highlight various sounds. I'm not going to be highlighting the end words of each line because I think it's fairly certain, very obvious that we got an A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C rhythm. And then we got E, and then here we got F, E, F, E, and F. Okay, so we're not going to really focus on the ending words. We're going to focus on the words that have internal rhythm and rhyme. And so here, for example, up at the first line, we have as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. So here we got the F, 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 and we have a D. Kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. So we also have a fla sound in here. And we also have the long I sound. So we got the long I as well. Okay. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies flies, draw, flame. Okay, we got another dray, draw, and then we got flay. And once again, we have all of these sounds. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Okay, so obviously we got some M's in here. We also have some R's in here. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells. So we have some short I's in here. Rim in. Over roundy. There's not much in the O sounds. We got a lot of M's. And then we have stones ring. So this stones, this is a long O, similar to over. And of course we have the stones, wells. So we have an S sound here, ring. So we have once again more R and another short I. So rim, roundy, ring. Then over here we have like each tucked string tells. So we have tuck. So we have a K. Tucked string tells. Each hung bells. So we got another K here. Like each tucked string tells. So we got a T. We got a T. We have a stra here. We have a stra, which has another T sound in it. Like each tucked string tells. Tucked tells. And then we have a repetition here. We got each and each. Each tucked string tells. Each hung bells bow swung. Okay, so for here we have hung, swung, tongue, and then we have lightly, fling, and thing, and thing. So once again, we have this repetition. So we got repetition, repetition, and this string, fling, thing, thing, and then we have a hung, swung, tongue. Okay, so we have a lot of or sounds. Okay, and then we have more repetition here, tells and bells. And here we got b, bow. So we got bells, bow, swung, fines, tongue to fling out. So we got F, out broad its name. So like each tucked string tells, each hung bells, bow, swung fines, tongue to fling out, broad its name. So here we have fling and find. Those are not the same kinds of I's. We do have a short I sound here, but it's not very, it's you can see here the alliteration is less tight. The consonants, assonance is easing up here. So we have bow, swung, fines, tongue. Okay, so here we have some assonance. We have the sound, tongue sound. Okay. Out broad its name. Okay. Each. So once again, we have another each. So this is repeating. So I'm going to actually change here, and I'm going to just underline each in a different color. Each. So we got 3 eaches in here. So each mortal thing does one thing and the same. So we got 2 things in here. We got 2 things in here. Does this mean that he's somehow bad? Well, AI would try to correct this, but we're going to look at why this is a fantastic technique that he draws on. There's a reason why repetition happens. And if you have ever studied the poem Bells by Edgar Allan Poe, you would understand a little bit what is going on here in this section. Okay, so each mortal thing does one thing and the same. So here we have the repetition. So this is basically like a form of consonants. So each mortal thing does one thing and the same. There's a lot of N's in here. You can see there's a lot of N's. And we also have these M's popping up as well. The M's continue to keep this quite warm. All right. Deals out that being indoors, each one dwells. Okay, so we're back to the each. So we have another one, each. So we're back to the repetition here of the each. And once again, this has some thematic reason for why it's happening. Okay, so now let's keep going on. Deals out, so we got a D sound, consonants, and another D sound. Since the D in indoors is in the center, we would say this is more leaning towards consonants than alliteration. Deals out that being indoors, each one dwells. There is quite a bit of N's in here, once again, which I feel is softening it. We also have the long E, deals, and each, right? And being. But as you can see, it's the assonance is starting to ease up. It's not focusing so much on the sounds and the experience. It's now shifting into idea land. So in some ways, you could think of this as the experience and then the thought. So we're moving from the experience of nature and we're slowly extracting into more abstract concepts. Okay, now we are going to look at this part here. Selves, goes, itself, myself, it speaks and spells. Okay, wow. All right, so we got it. E, goes, itself, myself, it speaks and spells. And here goes is more of an O sound than an E, so that's why I'm not marking it with an E, even though there's an E in it. Now, of course, we have the V, which also can sound like a harder F. And then, of course, we have the F and the F here. And, of course, we have the alliteration with the sp and the sp. But if we extract the P out of it, we also have consonants with selves, itself, myself, speaks, spells. Right? So we have, of course, that. And it connects as well with the previous line, which has the word dwells in it, which rhymes with spells. So once again, we have still some of this internal rhythm that sounds really great when you read it out loud. Crying, what I do is me, for that I came. All right, so we got some came here. What I do is me, for that I came. And this is really kind of where we have what we call the turn. Now, in sonnets, turns can happen in a couple different places. Some sonnet writers like to leave the turn until the last two lines. But here we can see that there's a turn because we're going into a more thought-focused experience instead of the sensory-focused experience. But we still have the long I sound here, right? What I do is me, for that I came. Okay, still very beautiful. I say more. The just man justices. Okay, and we got an M here. Just man justices. keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces. So, of course, we have some repetition in here. And, of course, we have double repetition. We have that sound of K, but we also have the G sound. Keeps grace, that all his going graces. Acts in God's eyes. So here and here, acts. So we have like that K sound as well. We have a continuation of the G sound. We also have I sounds, but we also have still a lot of ins. You see here, we got a lot of ins, is, right? So we have also the short I coming into play, which I think just simply is like the glue that keeps everything here together. Acts in God's eye. What in God's eye he is? Christ. So here we are going to have more repetition. So we're coming into repetition for Christ. And as I noted here, we got keeps going with grace. And interestingly enough, Christ, just like some of the other things we were looking at, has the K sound. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places. So we got pl sound. I don't know why I put that I in there. Let's get it out. 10,000 places. We want to really rest on that N. 10,000 places. Lovely in limbs. We got L's. And lovely. So we got some in eyes, not his. So we got the S sound. Limbs, eyes, his. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his. And of course, to kind of give a warmth to this, he's relying a lot on the M's and the N's. M's and N's are very, very warm, and they, in my opinion, they slow things down. That's just me. Maybe other poets disagree. To the Father, through the features of men's faces. Okay, so lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his. To the Father, so we got TH here, through the features of men's faces. So we got the F sounds, okay. To, so this is the oo sound, through the features of men's faces. Okay, so as you can see here, we can actually draw some general ideas. So I'm going to switch to another pink. Let's do a green. I feel like it's very naturey. So in the first line, what we're seeing a dominance in is K and F sounds. Here we have R and M sounds. Here we have a lot of K's and T's. Okay. Here we have a lot of F's, N's. Okay, so we'll put down F and N. Here we got a lot of M's and N's. Here we have a lot of N's, E's, and there's a few D's in here. And in here we have a lot of F and S. And this is the turn, so I'm not going to focus on it too much. Here we got J and M sounds. We got K and G sounds. Here we have more G/I sounds. Here we got more, and this is a mixed bag. So this here, I think, is, once again, it's kind of losing it a little bit. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000. So that we got a K, we got N, and we got PL for that line. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his. So I'm going to go with L for this one with short I, short vowel I sound. And then for the final one, we got TH, we got Fs, okay, and we got this mild ooh sound as well. Okay, so we can definitely start thinking about, well, what do, so what? Well, one thing that I'd like us to really think about is here, we have a lot of hard. So once again, I'm gonna change my thing yet again. So this is hard. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. So this is hard and soft. There's a hard and softness. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells. So this is soft. Hard. Stones ring like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. This feels more soft. We got more F's and N's. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. So this is more softer. Deals out that being indoors each one dwells. This is what I would call neutral, but still tending towards softness. Selves goes, itself, myself, it speaks and spells. Crying what I do is me, for that I came. So this is soft, and this has crying what I do. So we do have some T's in here. This is what I would call truly neutral. Once again, we're doing a turn here, so it's pretty obvious that he's not too concerned about trying to make a big deal out of it. But we still have that T and that C, so it's still leaning towards a harder feel. And I think that's to grab our attention, right? We went from hard, soft, hard, and then we went soft, 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 and now he's kind of drawing it back in. And then I say more, the just man justices. This feels harder. Keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces. This leans towards soft for me because of the G, but there's enough K in there to make it kind of more neutral. Acts in God's eyes what in God's eyes he is. This is still softer in my opinion. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places. Oddly enough, I would lean on this line toward being a bit harder. This is neutral to hard. And what I think the important part is what's making it harder is this part here, Christ 10,000. So this is a bit softer, but the fact that there is two Christs in here feels heavier, and I think it's drawing our eye to that. It's drawing our mind to that as we speak it. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, very soft. To the Father through the features of men's faces, soft. I think if you sit with this for a little bit, you might start to think, why is he going with these? Was it just, as you do? I think that can be absolutely possible. I think there are lots of people who kind of go with the organic moment. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I do want to draw an attention to, for example, that stood out to me, is that this hard line is also talking about some things that are very hard. It's talking about stones, it's talking about tucked strings, and it's talking about bells. And when it moves into bells, the next line actually sounds more like a bell. Bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. So it's very, very fascinating how he's marrying the weight and the hardness of the sound with some of the concepts that he's talking about. Like Kingfishers Catch Fire. That's about as hard as you can really get, with the Kingfishers catch, right? It's quite a strong opening to grab your attention. And if you think about the kingfisher, it has a very red throat and chest area. And then we have dragonflies draw flame. It's still quite strong. Still quite strong, but he's softening it before he leads into the next section. And if you think about it, kingfishers and dragonflies, these are living creatures, right? They have a multiplicity of being in some senses. I think dragonflies are softer in my mind. Kingfishers, though, even though they're birds, They have those beaks of theirs that stand out, that are quite prominent. And so once again, I just get the feeling of the poet trying to draw us in with a strong start, with these strong images of very definitive creatures before moving into more descriptive ways of tackling inanimate objects like stones and strings, bells, all of that. And as his poem progresses and as he gets more theoretical, we can see that he is becoming more focused on achieving the idea that he's aiming for. And this turn is quite strong because he's really shifting our attention. Okay, so we've looked at nature, we've looked at all of these things, we've experienced nature through language, and now we are going to be looking at the concepts. But even when he is looking at concepts, he is overall using language once again as a way to kind of draw us in, let us go out, draw us in, let us go out. And so he has some strong beginnings here, but then he softens up, and then he gets strong again, talking about Christ, and then he softens up, and he's basically giving us chances to breathe within his writing. This kind of act of breathing would be, in my head anyway, is kind of like a cousin to the concept of ma in Japanese film. This concept of sila in Jewish literature and poetry. This concept of taking a break and slowing down. I think a lot of people today as writers get bamboozled into thinking that your writing has to be high octane all the time or sleepy all the time. And the reality is this is actually a very real form of what I like to call dynamics. Okay, so these are like almost like music, almost like musical dynamics. So now that we've taken a little look at the sounds, we're going to get into the next section of this analysis. Okay, well, we got through that. Now our poem should be looking pretty marked up. Are we done yet? No, we're not done yet. We now understand generally what the poem is about, and we also now can begin to appreciate the amount of work that went into making this poem. And you might be wondering, why are we studying the sounds of a poem and the imagery of a poem and all of this context? How do they really link to each other? Well, the first thing before we get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the writer. So Gerard Manley Hopkins, born 1844, died in 1889, was an English poet, and through most of his life, he was a Jesuit priest. He basically became known for using language and rhythm in a very strange kind of way. Like I said, sprung rhythm. Now, he was born in Stratford, Essex. He was raised in a very religious Anglican household, and he went to Oxford University, where he actually began to develop skills in writing. And he became very close friends with Robert Bridges, and he loved poetry. Things were going well. In 1866, though, Gerard Manley Hopkins had for lack of a better word, he had a deep spiritual experience where he basically came to realize that he wanted to be not only Roman Catholic, but he wanted to devote his life to the orders. And under the influence of John Henry Newman, he turned his life radically into this whole monastic living. He abandoned poetry for some period of time. He joined a Jesuit order, and he basically prioritized his religious devotion over his creative expression for some time. But over time, you just can't deny that those parts of yourself. And so despite a lot of struggling, Hopkins came to understand that he really, really loved writing poetry and feeling personally inadequate. Some people believe that he was probably in love with one of his guy best friends who got married and had a family and everything. And Hopkins also struggled with feeling spiritually inadequate, and he worked through some of these struggles through his poetry later in life. And in those monastic orders, in that life of quiet and contemplation, he wrote very beautiful poetry, and he experimented with sprung rhythm, a metrical system that mimics natural speech. And he basically wrote such unique poetry that when you read his poems aloud, you can feel the musicality of his writing. And unfortunately, like most amazing authors, during his lifetime, Hopkins was never, like, nobody really knew. His poetry was very personal, but he was writing about things that most people can really dig into and understand and appreciate. He explored nature, he explored divinity, he explored human suffering, and he explored the concept of selving. And so I think a lot of people during his lifetime might have benefited from his work, but he simply was not sharing it. And it was only after he died, okay? He died in 1889, and it was only after he died, in 1918, his friend, Robert Bridges, published some of his poetry. And from that time onward, Gerard Manley Hopkins has become a real inspiration, because he was innovating on the English language in such a fresh and new way, particularly in the Victorian era, and a lot of his leaning into the more physical nature of sound did inspire later modernists, and honestly, his work has also deeply and spiritually impacted many readers who enjoy religious writing. So within this context, we have to understand that Gerard Manley Hopkins' religion, his faith in God, and his ideas about humanity are going to be deeply reflected in this poem. There's a reason why we're seeing concepts like God in Christ, why there's reference to Micah 6:8 in here. It's not an accident. He's not just, trying to be, highbrow. He's talking about something that he deeply believes in. So now, thinking about all of this, you can sit down and try to ask yourself, is there any connection between the sounds and the imagery and the rhythm of the poem and the concepts and ideals that Hopkins was writing about? So sit down, consider it, and then we'll get into my final analysis. Okay, final analysis time. I'm going to be reading a little bit of an essay. You might have to pause at various points in order to think about what I'm talking about, but you can keep your poem open before you, and you can hopefully follow along as I explain my thought processes. Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry is stunningly difficult to parse, but when exploring the spaces of and between his words, one cannot help but come to a deep appreciation of the ideals that Hopkins explored within his poetry. In As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Hopkins looks at a concept he considered deeply, selving, using a combination of skillful poetic technique and patterned metaphors. He explicates selving as a complex representation of meaningful and sincere spiritual identity and relationship between God, humanity, and the natural world. In Kingfisher, Hopkins uses consonants, assonance, and alliteration to create beautiful blended sounds which balance thought, action, Selah, and spoken. I noticed that in support of the theme of the first stanza's first line, which was fire, there was a repetition of the use of M, which creates warmth. In line 3, the use of the hard sounds t, k, highlight tucking, which draws attention to the manipulation of instruments, such as the strings and bells that are mentioned. Line 4 utilizes a combination of b, f, and short vowel oo sounds to slow the meter down so that it feels like a weighted bell. The first stanza also ends with hard-hitting consonants and blends, giving it more force and picking up the action for the second verse. Due to the second verse being more message-oriented, there is a toning down of consonant uses, but the use of j and g and l in the first 5 lines gives a sense of force to the injunctions to justice and keeping grace. However, like the ending of God's grandeur, Hopkins softens the last lines using more gentle f sounds. Another interesting technique Hopkins utilizes as a poet is the thread of metaphors linking nature to the arts and humanity and seeing all 3 united as bearers of divinity. The linking metaphors do appear to me to have a kind of pattern. In the first line, the fire of the kingfisher can be linked to the dragonfly's fire, which draws flame, a fire symbology. In the second line, the ring of the stones in the well could be linked to the instruments, the string and the bell. And the bell's tongue references forward to humanity, which speaks itself. It seems to me that if one takes this odd pay-it-forward referencing into account, it appears that Hopkins either consciously or unconsciously emphasized the integral links between nature and humans as beings that selve. Furthermore, one can also see how animate objects behave like inanimate. The kingfishers are drawing fire, and inanimate are anthropomorphized. The bells speak, blurring the lines between animate and inanimate nature, as well as humans, and thus creating a world that is inextricably tied together in acts of self-representation. Salving, an act of showing one's true and divine nature, links humanity, art, and nature to actions of self-representation, justice, and grace, which better shows Christ's images within us, within his injunction to the reader to show his or her better self. Hopkins' line, "Just man justices keeps grace," in the second stanza reminds me of Micah 6:8. Micah 6:8 states, "He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." Here, the Christian poet stresses not only the importance of internalizing faith, but also challenges the reader to become Christ in the eyes of God, and thus to see Christ in everyone else. This restorative relationship with God and oneself cannot but help resound within one's interactions with others, be it other human beings or nature. In a sense, you could say that this echoing of God in nature, God in humanity, God in art, God in the poem itself, and God in the reader, is reproduced within the repetition of symbols, words, and sounds of Hopkins' poetry. These echoes build upon each other and set each other off anew as one person's interaction with nature rekindles their heart of grace and allows them to pass goodness onward. As each echo resounds, the understanding of personal worth and dignity based on the image of God is carried on by another and another, just as Hopkins' poetry will be carried on into the future. That was my final analysis. I wrote this paper, short paper, for one of my professors. I felt very challenged by her when she said that modern day literature students can't do close reading, so this was my first attempt at academic level close reading. Looking back now, I think I could even talk more about the sounds. I definitely believe that the beginning is intended to bring force, but Gerard Manley Hopkins was clearly trying to create warmth, was trying to create weight, was trying to create tension, and he used these sounds to bring to life all of these different things that he was using as a metaphor for the concept of selving. And even more importantly, he uses this repetition like the bell that repeats itself and swings back and forth. He repeats over and over these important concepts. And the concept is, of course, that just like sound rings out, God's selfhood that he imprinted within nature is also still evident, regardless of what the world might look like. In this way, I feel like Gerard Manley Hopkins is ultimately extremely compassionate and hopeful, because even though the world is not what it should be, we can still see what it could be and what some of us believe it will be. Well, that's about it. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have also felt a bit uplifted by this very difficult but interesting poem. If you really like this and you would like to see me do other forms of close reading, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for listening again. I'll see you around next time.